Welcome to Nourishing the Mother, where inspired women talk about the journey of motherhood through the common thread of parenting, relationship, and sexuality as a path to consciousness. We keep our conversations honest, our experiences real, and our philosophies exploratory.
We believe that in order to raise incredible humans, we first have to raise ourselves. We know that in order to rock the family, you've got to nourish the mother. If you are here, you care about paving a path of conscious and intentional motherhood, connected with yourself and your gifts, and also illuminating your children in theirs so we may raise more whole humans who can impact this world in a more humane way. If you desire to integrate this learning practically and supportively into your life, then Soul-Driven Motherhood is your space to go deeper. Head on over to nourishingthemother.com.au or follow any of the links on our socials for Soul-Driven Motherhood.
We are Julie Tenner and Bridget Wood, and we're so grateful you're here.
Hello and welcome to Nourishing the Mother. I'm Bridget Wood.
And I'm Julie Tenner. And today's podcast is exploring the fantasies of motherhood. Now, this is really for Soul-Driven Motherhood as part of our Elixir Wisdom series, because what we're doing in there is talking about universal laws, how they apply and how you can apply them to your life. One of the ones that Bridget and I are most fascinated by is the concept that every fantasy that you hold or infatuation has a hiding nightmare that seeks to equilibrate your high feelings. You're often not aware of the nightmare until it comes screaming into your face. So it's just a really beautiful invitation into how you can have massive impact on your reality, on your world, and on your emotional charges by simply taking a moment to look at what fantasies you might be running and offering yourself a conscious opportunity to equilibrate them so the world doesn't have to do it for you. So that's where we're taking the conversation today, and we would love to remind you to jump onto nourishingthemother.com.au, scroll on down to the red banner, drop in your email, and once every so often you get a beautiful love letter from us, keeping you informed of everything happening in the world with us, so you can pick and choose where you'd love to dive deeper. nourishingthemother.com.au, where you can also find out about soul-driven motherhood.
We began this conversation before we hit record a little on, well, what are all the fantasies that we, begin motherhood with? And then we just kept rolling with them, didn't we? Because there's just so many that we kind of have this idea about, and then reality hits, and that reality can sometimes be crushing because you realize all of the one-sided, fantastical ideas that you thought something was going to be.
Yeah. Can you remember what fantasies you held before you actually had your baby? So pregnant with your first child.
Yeah.
Because I always laugh at this. I always think of that meme that's something along the lines of, we were all the best hypothetical parents.
Oh, yes. Oh, gosh. Because I read everything, right? And it's a classic thing, like professional women who go on to have their children in their late 20s or their late 30s or whenever it is, make sure, like any kind of endeavor, that they're very well read on it and they have, done all the things, right? And this was no different. And so I think for me, seeing that motherhood would be the answer to my lack of fulfillment in my work, and that so I could just transfer my lack of fulfillment and find fulfillment here. And I mean, I did for a really long time, but I also recognized quickly, I need something else too. And so, but then I would often run into this belief, which I think likely probably is not mine, but more my mother wound, that I should be able to be fully fulfilled being fully present with my children.
Yeah, I remember feeling that one too.
Yeah. And that should be enough for me. Like, listen to how many shoulds are here, right? And the difficulty that I wrestled with when I realized that, no, I still need something else You know, so like when my son was 3 months old, I was doing a magazine and feature writing course, even though I have a journalism degree. Because I was like, I need to create something, I've got to create. And there was, even though like that transition into motherhood fulfilled so many things to me, it still revealed where there was still voids. And so recognizing early on in that first year, this is beautiful and rich, but really still full of a whole lot of challenge that I probably didn't recognize was going to show up, and that I thought I was going to leave all this challenge that I was feeling like I was facing in my career and leave it there. Turns out I've just birthed it in this new form, not just with this child, but also in who I am as a woman. That this role isn't answering everything that I thought it was going to answer for me. And so I'm now having to meet more edges of what is a lifetime story of like not feeling good enough. And so that was a big one.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Well, I really want to honor that, because I actually think that's hugely courageous, just to see it and name it as well.
Yeah. And that, I think ask any mother, and the first year of your first child's life fucking blows you wide open.
Yeah.
And I think the bigger the fantasy, the bigger the crushing nightmare, right? Yeah. Or maybe you don't so much hit that in the first year. Sometimes it comes when the baby becomes a toddler. Because as a society, we infatuate with babies and tend to resent the toddler. So if we as women or mothers have infatuated with our baby and all of their deliciousness and not seen wider, then we'll find the toddler years particularly hard, because we have to meet more of them sometime. And if we don't meet the edges when they're babies, we meet the edges as they grow. So I recognize that that's also where it shows up.
Yeah. More of ourselves too, right? Because whenever we lose ourselves in anything or anyone, which is really ultimately the definition of
yeah.
At some point, you, aka the universe, needs to put that codependent stop sign up and push you back into yourself.
Yeah. Which can look like sleep issues, which can look like behavioral challenges, which can look like
relationship problems,
which is a big one, particularly first year of parenthood.
Yeah.
And this is where you and I keep coming back to, what is the function in this dysfunction? Because we don't necessarily see that as dysfunctional at all, but a function of healthy relating, which will push you back into yourself if you've become too codependent.
100%.
So even when I've hit edges with my kids, I'll be like, oh, what's this here for? And why this and why right now? Like, what is this pushing me into? What are they seeking here? What am I needing here with this dynamic? Rather than it being necessarily a problem, it's a place to be curious first.
100% place to be curious.
Yeah. So yeah, that one would be big. And I mean, I still maintain that I don't know that motherhood was a place to really lose myself. It is a place I continually find myself. I find it deeply rich for all of the ways in which I meet my conditioning, or I meet my beliefs and go, oh, where'd that come from? Hi, you know. And I love that. Like, I love that, but I also fucking hate it, because it's like, Jesus, that's like intense. Some of the things we don't realize we're holding on to, but that likely lurk in our subconscious and then pop through into consciousness at just the right time, through just the right conduit, whether that's our children or our relationship, right? I often think too, like when I look at the evolution of your working relationships and how much did you know, your timeline of like conscious relating map alongside your own development in motherhood. Because, you know, just like our children go through their child development, we're constantly going through our own developmental process.
Yeah.
And we never stop. Like, so we have this, I think it's hilarious that, you know, we as adult humans think that we're so much bigger and wiser than children, but like we're all children, all on a developmental process, right? Just looks different.
Yeah, totally.
Constantly being initiated all of the time.
Yeah, / humbled.
Initiated / humbled, whatever that looks like. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I think when I hear your story, I think my version of that for me was my inner monster. So I did all of my research was birth focused.
Yeah.
And I did basically nothing parent focused from there. I don't know what I thought was going to happen. I think
Which is funny for you because you had such a great mother wound.
Yeah, but I actually think that that was what constructed the biggest fantasy that I perceive I've ever run, which is I will be nothing like her.
Yeah. Yeah. Ouch.
And so by virtue of being nothing like her, which was my fantasy, that it would heal all ails. So there wasn't a void to read on.
Yeah.
Because I knew what I wasn't going to be, which in some way is just as big a fantasy as you will be. Right?
And like that's just the biggest, the moment that you initiate that belief and keep reiterating that belief is the moment that you are continuing to feed its opposite.
Right.
Which is that you are going to be everything like her.
Right. Which was why my first year with Heath was fucking brutal. Because the self-loathing that opening brought up within me and the re-traumatizing of my own trauma and pain was like fucking epic. It was enough to peel me like a banana and shatter me like a bomb. Like it was inside and it was outside. And the entire identity that I had crafted, the entire way that I had seen the world and myself within it was completely and totally destroyed. Like that shit is brutal. Like I literally remember being on the other side of feeling like just clawed myself out of the deepest well. The way they used to think of it was, oh God, what is that movie? Was it, I want to say it was a Brad Pitt movie, but I can't remember. And a little bit gory, and there was like this mass murderer who would skin women and wear their skins. Do you remember that movie?
No, it's not something I'd probably go for.
Murder, horror, you know, I wish at this moment I could remember what the movie was called. But I remember this scene of the victim in the end of this movie, spoiler alert, that ends up being saved. And the murderer keeps her in a well, so in a like bluestone cobbled well, like that is so deep and dark in this hole. And he sends her.
I think I do remember this.
He sends her food up and down in like a, you know, well bucket sort of thing.
Yeah.
And a torch at some point when he's pulling the bucket back up, and it highlights the gloss or the shine on the cobbles as it's coming back up, and all you can see are the broken off fingers and scratch marks and blood, as all of his previous victims have tried to claw their way out and have obviously fallen or whatever, but they've given up fingertips, and you know that's how desperate they've been to escape. And that particular imagery has always sat somewhere in my psyche. And when I think about that first year with Heath, that's what it felt like for me. I felt like I was all of those victims, the ones that, you know, had tried their way to scrape up stone by stone because they felt their life depended on it, and they'd snapped a finger and fallen back down to the bottom only to get up and try again because their life depended on it.
Yeah.
And I felt like the woman who eventually climbed out of that. So when I think about equilibrating fantasy and nightmare, they're not separate in their degrees. So my degree of suffering or perception of suffering was equal to my degree of fantasy. That's how big it was.
Yeah.
So we, as humans, only experience revelation from pain and suffering. It's what cracks the ego that keeps us confined in a tight little shell that's grown too small, contained. It has to be cracked open. It's hard work for the baby bird to chip out of the shell or to leave the nest and learn to fly and fall to the bottom of the tree, right? Like, we have to do that. That's how revelation is found. But the degree of that was extreme because the degree that I had built up a construction was extreme.
So what you experienced in that first year was a natural equilibration to the level of one-sided infatuation you had about who you were going to be.
Yeah. And by virtue of that, the depth of suffering also, potentially, if you stay on that path, allows you the depth of enlightenment to bring light to, or wisdom, or revelation. So it was still the year of, I perceive, my greatest growth, probably the last year, because that felt like another version of that. So, not that dramatic though. So I still think that that was the best year of my life when I look at it from a soul growth perspective and who I became and what I shared and what that opened up. But that's not to minimize from the degree of suffering, which really, on many levels, was self-imposed from the degree of infatuation.
Yeah. And you had to strip yourself. So, like, there's so many layers you had to strip back to get to the core of it because neither of them were real.
No. Right.
You had to see all that nightmare.
The suffering is only there if you're attaching to the fantasy, right? Because what are you suffering from? It's only the attachment.
Yeah. It's like the concept of betrayal, like somebody betraying you. Nobody really betrays you. You betray you through the projection of your value onto them for them to live always in what you would expect, essentially. It's again back to that self and the projection onto that situation or person. The projection onto Heath to be a baby that would or wouldn't do.
Well, it was me. It was that I would or wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, then I had the baby who perfectly took me to all of those places.
Yeah.
He didn't. It's hard to say.
That's right.
All things. And I didn't know anything either.
But you can also be like, it's like, I read this really great quote when I was researching for my Disrupt course last year, and it was all about, you can grow up well into adulthood and think you're a really good person until you become a parent.
Yeah, summed up.
because there's like, it's not really until you're a parent that you'll have your buttons pushed in ways that they've probably never been pushed before.
Yeah.
Like you
don't have an out in parenthood.
No. And you also have like another human biologically programmed to express whatever you've repressed.
Yeah. Blows my mind.
So, of course, it has to be one of the hardest pathways.
And And it was through that experience being so hard that it actually led me on to all of the things like natural groups and, you know, extended breastfeeding and baby wearing and I can't even think all of the other spaces that I eventually 100% found myself in.
Yeah.
So that, you know, I mean, I have my first year only 18 months apart. So we're talking about the first year of life and the first 3 months of Jade's pregnancy where I'm finding it hard, and probably was up until he was about 9 months old, to be fair. And by the time she's 18 months old, I completely know who I am. I'm completely infatuated with attachment parenting.
Yeah.
You know, wear her for every sleep. We co-sleep together. We breastfeed till she's 3. Like, I meet, and it's through that experience then that I up-level my, or perceived up-leveling of my attachment parenting then to aware parenting.
Yeah.
And each time I can see the fallout from that. So co-sleeping is the best solution for your children's health and development until you meet your rageful monster when they're not sleeping and they're kicking you at night or climbing up the ladder, or, and I'm like, no, that's fucking it. There's another way, and it doesn't have to mean that it diminishes your relationship or their intelligence.
It's a pivot point, right? But it's when you've built up an identity as that.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And still co-sleeping baby wearing is the best. This third child of mine's going to have the best of all of my knowledge now and will be the most conscious creation that I've ever consciously created. And, you know, I'm here just to devote the entirety of myself in a way that I'd never allowed myself to be so utterly devoted, because there'd always been work and things that I wanted to do. So I never had totally developed, like I had never 100% given myself to my children, because I've always had a business. I had a business with Heath, had a business with Jade, always. So there's always been a split for me around how much of me was invested in motherhood. Whereas for Lola, I stopped everything. I will be nothing but devoted mother. And this will be the most conscious, no regrets, play it all on the dance floor, most delicious experience of my life. Well, one, she didn't want to co-sleep. And that was the first one that was so hard for me to let go of. This child who, and I was still like, co-sleeping's the best, certainly for newborn.
Yeah, yeah.
No other concept. Like, yeah, when they get old, I mean, I moved Jade out of my bed when she was like 7 months old. Maybe she was older. She's probably like 11 months old. Can't remember. I remember her starting to annoy me at 7 months old and climbing me like a ladder. And by 11 months, I definitely remember her being in her own bed. But I was still like, definitely first, 6 months of life, 100%, definitely first 3 months of life, best thing in the whole world. Can't wait for those snuggles. Love it. Brought you already had the cardigans pre-prepared. So you know how your shoulders get cold and how when you're sleeping, one arm's always out and, already had the cardigans pre-prepared, all ready for my co-sleeping situation. And Lola would not have a bar of it. And it was brutal to me. But put her in a cot, didn't even have to rock her. Boom. As soon as she had personal space, slept literally like a baby. And it literally took my home birthing midwife to be like, do you think maybe she really likes personal space? And I was like, no, she doesn't. The best thing that she likes is to be right on me, right next to me, because that's what's best for her.
Yeah, yeah.
And I still remember how much I howled when my midwife was there and I laid her in the cot and she just went to sleep after so many nights of not sleeping at all.
Gosh, that's amazing.
Oh, and she was literally the unicorn baby. Now I kind of realized that, there was other things at play. But in terms of a baby, she was sleeping through the night by, seriously, like 5 weeks old. Put her in a cot, boom, just slept like an angel. Never had that before. So all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I've judged these cot sleeping mothers my whole life. And then I'm like, I'm that woman. I'm the best thing in the whole world. How have I not seen this before?
Yeah.
So, whatever you judge, you breed, attract, or become.
Yeah, right. God.
So here I am, cot sleeping mother. And then Lola, my beautiful conscious creation that I just wanted to devote my all to, slowly and slowly, the older she got, required that I devote more of myself to her until there is no piece of me that isn't entirely consumed by her, to the point where she also has the perfectly manifested body in which she can't move without me. Like, I move her body. So I got my Velcro baby. I got my attachment with zero space and an invitation to meet everything 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without respite, literally. Like, literally. And I think that I needed so much attachment before I detached from the fantasy of attachment.
Like you had to have that so in your face
because I
balance the level of...
I wasn't doing that consciously on my own. The only way that that fantasy was equilibrating was if I had a child that like took my attachment to such an edge that I was the one that flipped. Right? So we manifest in our children, the children who reject us, so we separate and come back into ourselves, or we manifest and co-create an experience in which we do that for ourselves. And that was what I got. By the age of 2 years old, I was seriously in PTSD. Like, that's why baby number 4 was so hard for me to even wrap my head around being pregnant, because I was literally felt like I had post-traumatic stress from how hard that experience had been with Lola, and continued to be, and still is on many levels. So I see the fantasy of the totally conscious, totally consumed, totally attached, and I see my nightmare of all of those things, because she is all of those things. I just didn't see that there was a drawback to those things until I'm living with them. And now I see them every day.
It's just so amazing, isn't it? Like, you just go...
Be careful what you wish for. That's what I think.
Yeah.
Be careful what you fantasize over. You know, oh my God, he's the answer to my whole world, best boyfriend in the whole world. I've never loved like this before. I've never felt like this before. He's a drug dealing pimp who smacks me around. Like, this is seriously the reality in the world. The bigger the fantasy, the bigger the nightmare.
Yeah. And yet we live in a world that just sells the fantasy. Like, you know, and like, if you look at our obsession with entertainment, our constantly on all of the time dopamine hit, like short-term gratification, I mean, all those things are so fantasy driven, and we're told to celebrate the fantasy and to live in the fantasy. But the bigger the addiction and one-sidedness, the bigger the crash. It's like the opium of the masses, to have like all support, no challenge, or to be always kind and never mean, to be always conscious, never harsh or unconscious, to always love motherhood, not resent it. Right?
Yeah.
So the work is like seeing the function in the things that equilibrate you, isn't it?
Yeah, and I just think it's worth seeing it play out in the world, and just to really sit down and ask yourself, or do a reconciliation right now of what are the fantasies I'm running. Because if I can consciously ask myself what the drawbacks to those are now, I don't have to unconsciously manifest a situation in which to discover them. So you can consciously with some degree of impact, fast track your wisdom and your emotional charges. Therefore, your reality. And I think fantasies are one of the best and most interesting. They're actually, I think, the hardest ones for us to get really honest with ourselves about.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because I'm thinking, I don't know if I'm running fantasies at the moment, but of course we are. We all are, because that's human nature.
Yeah, I just think we don't see them, or we don't want to see them, or we just can't even imagine that there's a drawback to that thing we love.
Or a drawback to that thing that we think could only be one way, could only be this. And like, I'm working with a client at the moment on this quite intensely, and you'll know your degree of infatuation when your sensory and motor functions are so trained to only see something a particular way, and that like your vision, which usually is peripheral and like can see wide on things, is super, 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 super narrow on this particular topic. And that your physiology is also kind of plugged into like the feeling of like fantasy even in your body at the idea of having that thing, so that every like sensory feeling within you and every waking consumption that your brain's trying to go on is all orienting towards that experience. You know, you're running an epic fantasy on what that would be like to have, right? And yet, you know, for anybody who's ever run an epic fantasy on motherhood or mothering, you'll know that that's bred, you know, the child with extreme sleep challenges or
the self-identity in motherhood that is so crushing you don't even know who you are anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know that one.
And I think also that one, if that's a pattern, will come up at key ages that your children hit. If you self-identify so much with motherhood that as they represent ages that create distance from you and your identity as that for them, then if you're not conscious, you'll make it about them and not about actually your own differentiation and equilibration.
I actually think we do that I think we project way more than we even remotely want to own.
Yeah, me too.
It took me a really long time to see how I was like vomiting my top values over certainly my first two children. It took me a really long time to even, well, firstly to conceive of that, and secondly to even see that.
In terms of like,
I think our way is just like the only best way for this world to run. Like even that just blows my mind sometimes, because I remember how like you absolutely don't treat children like that. You treat them like this. Like how could you even possibly, there's no other way.
Yeah, extreme black and white thinking.
Yeah, I just, like that's how everyone on some level is thinking about their own top values.
Yeah.
And
Because yeah, that's right. Because in our highest values, we are more, you know, like when we're more ordered and organized, which means we're likely to be more, well, this way is right, you know, self-righteous, less nuanced, because we have certainty until we don't.
Yeah, and just we take it upon ourselves to assume that what we know of the world to be true and most meaningful is what we wish to impart upon our children. But it may not be in the greatest alignment with their own vision, mission, and values.
That's why it's like that practice to constantly come and like ask yourself, like, who are they right now? Like, who are they really? Yeah. When I take off like my like lens of projection onto what I want for them, who are they showing me that they are right now?
Yeah.
And can I let go of what I thought I had in mind for who they're revealing themselves to be and what they need?
What can I love beyond them supporting my top values?
Yeah.
Can I love someone when they challenge my top values? Because that's really love. It's easy to love someone who loves what you love and sees the world the way that you do. Far harder to love someone who challenges the way that you see the world. And yet I would argue probably a deeper love.
Yeah. Because it's less conditional.
Yeah. Yeah. Those of us who seek such unconditional love and yet are so conditional in the way that we love humans around us.
Yeah. It's big.
So when you are exploring the fantasies of your own motherhood and how they're creating your current reality or emotional charges as you come running into the equilibrating nightmare, it's just designed to bring you back to an equilibrium or a state of homeostasis, of greater love and capacity to love where no one's in a pit or on a pedestal. That's ultimately the universal orchestration of it is for greater, deeper, wider love of you, for you, with you. But you have some level of consciousness that plays into that about whether you do it for yourself or you wait for the world to do it for you. And I think that that is the invitation here in looking at what are the fantasies or watching around you. Whoa, that is a big fantasy. I'm kind of biting my lip as I'm squinting as I go, whoa, where's that person going with that? That seems really like that's going to be hard.
And yeah, I mean, the classic one is you see it in relationships.
Oh, that's why I'm wincing, because I'm like, ooh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. He's so amazing. Oh my God, I'm just so in love and he's doing this.
I've never felt like this before. Not like this.
This is different.
Alarm bells. I'm like, oh no. Because unfortunately, I mean, I made a pretty snide joke before, but the reality is that cliche happens more often than we realize.
Yeah.
And nightmares come in many, many, many different forms. So, yes, lose yourself in feeling, but don't lose yourself so completely that you are not also aware of a drawback to this situation, to this support, to this feeling. You just got to know. I don't know what I'm trying to say here. Help me out, Bridge. I think just be aware of the fantasy.
And notice when you when you're in, like, in an infatuation or in a fantasy, when you notice like that your language is really speeding up, that your inflection's going higher, that kind of you're a bit like a runaway train, and that you find yourself always wanting to talk about this one thing. And it's big in your life and it feels dramatic or it feels electric. That's not necessarily your soul talking to you that you're in alignment. It's your fantasy feeding itself. And so what would be the drawbacks of what you see as perfect? Definitely. Drawbacks to top values, drawbacks to your 7 areas of life. And if you want to come and do a workshop with us on that, then Soul Driven Motherhood is your place to do that. And we would love to have you bring consciousness and enlightenment to your life as it exists now and as it evolves. You can find out more about Elixir, the Wisdom Series, and Soul Driven Motherhood this month at nourishingthemother.com.au, Nourishing the Mother on Facebook and Instagram. And to connect with you, Bridget, is bridgetwood.life. And you, Jules?
Is julietenner.love.
Beautiful. Remember to nourish the woman, to rock the family.
And we'll see you next week when we continue to peel back the layers on your mothering journey.
Thank you so much for listening. We literally couldn't do this without you. Please share this podcast with anyone you think it would be medicine for.
And if you're ready to ask, in what ways can I show up more fully, live more meaningfully, parent more wholly, and love more unconditionally? How can I mine the wisdom from the experiences of my life and expand into those challenges? Then you're a soul-driven, heart-led mama who's ready for conversations and a community that supports her journey. Come join Soul Driven Motherhood. We'd love to have you.
And if you feel like giving back a little to this free content, please rate us on iTunes or Facebook, all of which helps the podcast reach more mamas who need this type of tonic for the soul.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/TheWellnessCouch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives.
Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.